When someone pulls away, especially an avoidant, it can feel like they're completely done with you. But what if I told you that even in silence, there are unspoken expectations they have of you? Yes, even during no contact, avoidants are often quietly watching and waiting. If you're anxious, you might be spiraling, overthinking, or tempted to chase. But here's the twist. That silence doesn't mean they've checked out. It means they're expecting certain things from you. And knowing this can shift everything. Avoidants, despite their tendency to withdraw, often expect to remain emotionally significant in your life, even when they're the ones creating the distance. It might seem contradictory at first. How can someone who's pulling away still want to be desired? But this is where the psychological tug-of-war begins. Avoidants typically have a deep-rooted fear of engulfment, of losing their autonomy in close relationships. So when things get too emotionally intense, their instinct is to retreat. But here's the part that's not so obvious. While they're pulling away, they're often secretly hoping that you're still thinking about them. They want to be missed, not pursued, not begged, not chased, but missed in a quiet, almost reverent way. It's not about them wanting to be completely cut off. In fact, that kind of cold disconnection would likely be deeply unsettling to them on a subconscious level. What they want is distance without disappearance. They don't want confrontation, they don't want to feel trapped, but they do want to feel that they still hold a place in your heart. It's as if they're stepping back to get space, but expecting you to quietly hold the door open behind them, just in case they want to come back. They're not asking you to text them, but they're often hoping you'll post something that reminds them you still care. They may not want a conversation, but they'll scroll through your stories to see if you're hurting, missing them, thinking of them. In their mind, your silence should still reflect longing. For someone with an anxious attachment style, this is especially confusing. Because the anxious person often wants clarity. They want communication, reassurance, and they want to solve things when there's a disconnect. Silence feels like rejection. Distance feels like abandonment. So when the avoidant goes quiet, the anxious partner interprets that as a sign to act, to reach out, to fix, to prove their value. But that's exactly what overwhelms the avoidant. What they crave is space paired with the security of being desired. It's a strange formula. Don't contact me, but make me feel like I matter. And this can put the anxious person in a loop of self-doubt and suppressed expression. They start monitoring themselves, asking, if I don't say anything, will they think I don't care? But if I reach out, will I scare them off? This is where the anxious person can often start over-functioning emotionally. They rehearse messages they never send. They post with the hope of being seen. They suppress tears during the day, only to unravel at night, wondering why someone who needed space is still checking their profile or liking old photos. It's the avoidance paradox. They disconnect to feel safe, but they hope to remain emotionally central even in absence. And that expectation is rarely voiced. It lives in their behavior, in the way they resurface after weeks with a casual message, testing the waters to see if the door they walked out of is still unlocked. They might not say they missed you, but they'll ask how you've been. They won't say they were thinking of you, but they'll mention something only you two shared. That's their way of checking if they've still got a place in your emotional world. It's important to understand that this isn't usually calculated or manipulative. For many avoidants, this pattern is driven by fear of closeness, but also fear of being forgotten. They don't know how to sit comfortably in intimacy, but they don't want to lose it entirely either. And so they end up creating distance as a way to breathe, while simultaneously hoping that the person they've pushed away hasn't stopped loving them. In no contact, this shows up as subtle expectations that the anxious person remains emotionally tethered. It might look like checking your activity, waiting to see if you'll break the silence, expecting you to respond immediately if they finally do reach out. They want to be missed, but only on their terms. Not with chaos, not with confrontation, but with quiet, steady yearning that doesn't demand anything from them. For the anxious person, this dynamic can become exhausting because it feels like being asked to care loudly in silence. It's a performance of loyalty without applause. You're expected to remain emotionally available without expression, present without proximity. And that internal tension of wanting to reach out but being told not to of being watched but not acknowledged can become deeply destabilizing. The avoidant, meanwhile, continues to exist in that contradiction, needing to pull away to protect themselves, while simultaneously hoping the person they've pulled away from hasn't emotionally moved on. Avoidants tend to walk a tightrope when it comes to emotional connection. On one hand, they deeply crave intimacy just like anyone else, but on the other, they fear what intimacy might cost them, losing their independence, being overwhelmed, or feeling emotionally trapped. So when a relationship begins to feel too intense or vulnerable, they instinctively retreat. But this retreat doesn't mean they want to be forgotten or discarded. In fact, one of the things they often secretly hope for is that you'll still want them, but that you won't pressure them to come back. They want to feel like they matter, that you still see them as desirable, but they don't want to be pulled into any emotional confrontation or be forced to define what's happening between you. They want to be wanted, but in a way that doesn't threaten their autonomy. This creates an emotional bind for the anxious partner. Anxious individuals tend to seek closeness when they feel distance. When there's disconnection, their natural instinct is to close the gap, to talk, to get clarity, to prove that the bond is still there. But the avoidant sees this as a threat to their space. And so, ironically, the more the anxious person tries to show love, care, or even just concern, the more the avoidant feels the urge to retreat further. What makes this even more confusing is that the avoidant is often still emotionally invested during no contact. They're just not showing it in a way that looks familiar. Instead of checking in or being open, they might be silently observing from a distance. They may not be calling, but they're thinking about you. They may not be texting, but they're hoping you still care. And more than anything, they're hoping you don't make them feel obligated to respond to your emotions. So now there's this strange in-between space where the avoidant wants emotional reassurance, but only on their terms. They want to know you still care, but they don't want to be pulled into a conversation about the relationship. They want to know you miss them, but not if it means them having to handle the discomfort of emotional intimacy. They crave validation, but not vulnerability. And so they look for signals, subtle, indirect, and safe signals that tell them they still matter to you. A photo that hints at nostalgia, a story that shows you're not completely over it, a quote that sounds like it could be about them. These things give them the reassurance they want without demanding anything from them in return. This puts the anxious person in a bind, because while they want to reach out and resolve things, they often sense that doing so would only push the avoidant further away. So instead, they might begin to try and signal their care in non-threatening ways. They might post something soft and emotional, hoping it's seen. They might avoid dating anyone new, not because they're not ready, but because they don't want to accidentally send a message that they've moved on. They might wait, silently, hoping the avoidant sees their patience as proof of love rather than desperation. And for the avoidant, these subtle signs are often enough to maintain that feeling of being wanted, without having to step out of their emotional safety zone. But here's the catch. The avoidant often doesn't fully consider the toll this takes on the anxious person. They don't realize that the anxious individual is carrying the weight of the relationship's emotional needs in silence. They expect to be wanted, but they don't want to reciprocate that emotional openness. They want space, but they want the other person to remain close in spirit. This imbalance can leave the anxious person feeling like they're constantly giving emotionally without receiving anything back. It's a one-way flow of desire, where the anxious person is expected to care deeply, consistently, and quietly, while the avoidant remains emotionally protected and uninvolved. Avoidants may also interpret silence from the anxious person as indifference, even though that silence might be coming from a place of deep restraint and heartbreak. They want to feel valued, but they often resist doing the vulnerable work of expressing their own feelings, so instead, they hope to feel wanted through absence. They assume that if the other person truly cared, they'd still be emotionally attached, even without words. And in this expectation, they continue to exist in that contradiction, needing space to feel safe, yet craving signs that they are still emotionally relevant. One of the most overlooked aspects of avoidant behavior during no contact is the quiet expectation that you will remain emotionally loyal to them, even while they are emotionally distant. They may not say it out loud, and they may not even consciously realize it, but avoidants often carry a deeply ingrained belief that the connection you once shared should still, in some form, be preserved by you, even if they've stepped away. It's not uncommon for an avoidant to go silent, create space, and seemingly detach, but still hold a subconscious hope that you're not emotionally moving on. In their mind, distance doesn't necessarily equal disconnection. It just means they need time. But during that time, they want to believe that you're still emotionally invested in them, that you're not giving that part of yourself to anyone else. This expectation often shows up in subtle ways. They may not reach out or communicate directly, but they'll keep tabs on you through social media, mutual friends, or even just mentally replaying moments you shared. They want to know that you're still emotionally theirs, even though they're not actively showing up in the relationship. There's a kind of quiet possessiveness that can exist in avoidant individuals. One that's not about control in an overt sense, but more about wanting to hold emotional space in your heart without having to do the work of maintaining the relationship. It's a form of emotional entitlement that says, I need my space, but I also need to know that you're still connected to me. For the anxious person, this can feel like being trapped in an invisible contract. You're no longer in active communication. You're respecting their need for space. But at the same time, you feel the pressure to not move on too quickly, not post something too joyful, not show interest in someone else, because deep down, you worry they're still watching. You wonder if being too happy will make them think you never cared. You hesitate to open yourself to new connections, not because you're not ready, but because a part of you still feels like you owe them your loyalty. This dynamic often leads to emotional stagnation, where you're frozen in place, unable to move forward, yet not being pulled back either. Avoidants often romanticize the idea that if a connection was real, it shouldn't fade just because of distance. They might even see your emotional loyalty during no contact as proof of your depth, your value, your commitment. It's not uncommon for them to reach out weeks or months later and expect you to be emotionally available as if no time had passed. They're not thinking about the silent struggle you endured, the sleepless nights, the internal dialogue you had to silence just to get through the day without reaching out. They're thinking about the idea that you must still feel the same way, because in their mind, nothing has really ended. There's just been a pause. This belief can show up in confusing and contradictory ways. They might show a hint of jealousy if they think you're moving on, even though they made no effort to maintain the connection. They might try to subtly test your loyalty, liking a post, sending a low-effort message, or making a casual comment to see if you'll still respond with warmth and emotional openness. They may say something vague like, I was just thinking about you, not to reopen the relationship, but to check if they still have access to your emotional world. It's not malicious, it's protective. It's their way of maintaining a sense of emotional security without risking vulnerability. For someone with an anxious attachment style, this can feel like being emotionally held hostage. You've been asked for space, and you're giving it. You've gone silent, respected boundaries, and even worked on your healing. But at the same time, there's a constant background noise of, don't forget me, don't let go, don't give yourself to someone else. It's a double bind that forces you to stay emotionally monogamous to someone who isn't offering clarity or connection. You end up carrying the emotional load of two people, mourning the relationship, waiting for answers, and remaining loyal to someone who isn't giving you any indication of where you stand. This creates a kind of emotional limbo where your healing is delayed because part of you is still emotionally occupied. You feel guilty for trying to move on, for finding joy, for laughing again, because there's this unspoken rule that to prove your love was real, you have to remain emotionally faithful, even when they're not showing up. Avoidants often underestimate the emotional labor they place on others through this expectation. They want the comfort of knowing they still matter to you, but they don't want to be responsible for maintaining that connection. And so they expect you to hold emotional space for them, even while they're absent. Avoidants often create distance in a relationship not because they no longer care, but because closeness feels threatening, Intimacy for them can trigger a deep discomfort rooted in the fear of being overwhelmed, controlled, or emotionally engulfed. So when they back away and initiate no contact, it's rarely as final as it seems. In fact, many avoidants expect that you'll continue to be emotionally present for them, even if they're not ready to re-engage. And part of that expectation includes something very specific but rarely spoken. They want you to wait. Not in an overt, obvious way. They may never ask you directly. They may not even acknowledge that they've created this expectation. But in the background, often quietly, and without admitting it even to themselves, they assume you'll wait for them to come back, reflect, or reconsider things at their own pace. They might not want a relationship right now. They might say they need time or space or clarity, but at the same time, they expect the emotional door to remain open. They want to know that when and if they decide to come back, they'll still be welcome. They expect that you won't be with someone else, that you won't have emotionally detached, that you won't have fully healed or closed the chapter. They count on you to remain emotionally paused, just as they are, only they've chosen to pause by pulling away while expecting you to pause by holding on. It's a dynamic that places the anxious person in a suspended emotional state, one where they're not given certainty or closure, but are still emotionally tethered. For someone with an anxious attachment style, this creates an unbearable pressure. Because while avoidants are off processing, or more often avoiding their feelings in silence, the anxious person is left with 1,000 questions. Was it something I did? Are they coming back? Should I wait? Should I move on? Every day of silence feels like another layer of confusion. But the anxious person, despite their pain, often holds on to hope. They don't want to seem needy, so they stay quiet. They don't want to push the avoidant further away, so they don't reach out. But deep down, they're waiting for a sign, waiting for clarity, waiting for the moment when the avoidant finally returns and explains everything. Avoidants often interpret this patience as devotion. They see your quiet endurance as proof that you cared, and when they return weeks or even months later, they often act as though little time has passed. They expect the emotional climate to be exactly as they left it. In many cases, they're surprised or even upset when it isn't. If you've grown distant, they wonder what changed. If you've moved on, they may feel betrayed. But the truth is, they placed you in a holding pattern without agreement or communication. They assumed that emotional loyalty would be enough to keep the connection alive in their absence. They believed that the connection could be maintained without effort, that your heart would remain fixed while they figured things out. This mindset can lead to deeply imbalanced dynamics. The avoidant takes their time, reflects on their own schedule, dips in and out emotionally when it feels safe. Meanwhile, the anxious person is caught between respecting boundaries and holding on to hope. They delay healing. They resist letting go. They don't explore new possibilities because they fear that doing so would close the door forever. It's not that the avoidant is malicious. It's that they often lack awareness of the emotional responsibility they place on the other person. They've been conditioned to protect their own space, but they rarely think about what that space costs someone who craves closeness and reassurance. There's also a subtle emotional test happening here. The avoidant, whether they realize it or not, is watching to see how you behave in their absence. Are you reaching out too much? That's overwhelming. Are you completely silent and distant? That could feel like abandonment. The sweet spot for them is you staying emotionally connected without disrupting their sense of freedom. They want to know that you're still emotionally available, but that you're not making any demands. And that's the unspoken waiting game they expect you to play. They want to be the one who decides when reconnection happens. They want to feel safe in the knowledge that they can return at their own pace, without fear that you've moved on or closed your heart. This dynamic often leads to a deep sense of emotional limbo. You may not be sure if you're in a breakup or just a break. You may second-guess yourself every time you feel ready to move forward, wondering if that's the moment they'll come back. You may delay your healing, suppress your desires, and dim your own growth, all because of this unspoken hope that your patience will be rewarded. But the avoidant, in creating space for their own comfort, often overlooks the emotional toll that waiting takes on someone who never got a clear answer. Avoidants often rely on emotional ambiguity to maintain control and safety within a relationship dynamic. During no contact, they may create distance, go quiet, or withdraw completely, but beneath that silence is a strong, often unconscious expectation that you will continue to interpret their absence in the most generous light possible. They expect you to read between the lines, to give them the benefit of the doubt, to understand their need for space without resentment. They want to feel understood without having to explain themselves. It's a dynamic that places a silent pressure on you to keep assigning meaning to their absence in a way that protects the image of who they were when they were connected to you. That absence, for them, is not meant to feel like rejection. It's supposed to be read as need, complexity, depth, and they hope you'll fill in the blanks with empathy rather than closure. This expectation that you'll emotionally decode their silence stems from how avoidants are often wired to process emotion internally. They struggle to articulate what they feel, especially when it's vulnerable. They aren't comfortable with emotional transparency, particularly if it requires them to admit weakness, confusion, or responsibility. So instead of communicating what's going on, they opt for withdrawal. In their mind, that retreat should be understood as self-protection or emotional necessity. But they often underestimate how confusing and painful that silence becomes for someone who's anxiously attached. You're left wondering whether they're gone for good, whether you mattered at all, whether the entire connection was a lie. But the avoidant is expecting you to know, without them having to say anything, that this distance isn't about devaluing you. It's about managing their own fear. This emotional ambiguity becomes a kind of test, not a deliberate or cruel one, but a passive one. The avoidant is observing, even from afar, whether you'll stay emotionally safe for them, whether you'll continue to believe in the connection, whether you'll keep the door open, maintain the emotional bond, and hold space without pushing. They're watching to see if you still see them the way you did before they left, if you still believe they're good, if you still feel connected to the best version of them, if you're still hoping for reconciliation rather than closure. This is the emotional narrative they want you to live in during no contact. That they're not abandoning you, they're just overwhelmed, and they hope you understand that without needing to have a conversation. For the anxious person, this creates an exhausting emotional load. You're not just dealing with the pain of absence, you're also being asked silently to stay emotionally generous. You're expected to remain empathetic towards someone who is no longer showing up. You're expected to wait, to hope, and to assign noble reasons to their silence, all while receiving nothing in return. It's a form of emotional limbo that asks you to become both the partner and the interpreter. You're translating their distance into meaning. You're crafting an emotional story that keeps them human, keeps them close, keeps them safe in your heart. But every day you do that, you're extending grace in the dark, not knowing if it's ever going to be seen or reciprocated. Avoidants are often more comfortable with this type of emotional connection, where the bond is maintained through unspoken loyalty rather than real-time vulnerability. They expect you to carry the emotional thread without them having to tie it. They rely on the idea that the connection is strong enough to endure without their active participation. And in doing so, they place the anxious person in a role of emotional caretaker, even in their absence. You're the one holding the connection together with memory, with faith, with interpretation. You're the one imagining they're struggling, that they care but can't express it, that their silence is a form of love in disguise.